This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Martin Woessner, who is the author of the best book I've read on Terrence Malick. I make no exceptions there. An Examined Life. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here.
This is going to be a little bit of a hybrid episode. We're going to do a Writers on Film episode as per every author that I have invited on, in which we talk about the book. But we're also going to be looking at the film Knight of Cups by Terrence Malick and paying a particular attention to that a little bit later on in the episode. So you'll be getting a little bit of mix. It's Writers on Film and it's the Malick Hour all at once. So first of all, I know you've been working on this book for a long time, Martin. What was the sort of the inception of it?
So I started working on this book a long time ago. I actually went to grad school in intellectual history, and I ended up writing a dissertation on the American reception of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And it was while I was doing research for that a long time ago that I stumbled across this translation of Heidegger into English, and the translator had the name Terrence Malick. And I thought, that can't be the same Terrence Malick that directed The Thin Red Line, that movie I saw with my dad back in college that, I really thought about for way too long. And lo and behold, it turned out that it was the same Terrence Malick. And I kind of put that, filed that away somewhere and thought, oh, that would be really fun to kind of go look that up or find some more information about it. But I was busy trying to finish a dissertation and trying to get a job teaching and doing all the other stuff. So it took a while before I actually did go back to it. And that was sort of the origin. I sort of stumbled into it. And I didn't really have at least an academic background in film. I didn't study film. I didn't take film classes or film theory or anything like that. I had studied history and philosophy. And so I took a sort of different approach, I think, to trying to understand Malick's career in the long run, which was a kind of intellectual history approach, a kind of intellectual biography. What were the intellectual sources of his films? But it also became, for me, a kind of second education in film, right? To understand this filmmaker, I had to learn something about film as well. And so in that regard, the film was really a great kind of education for me. And I try to do interdisciplinary work to look at the way in which film gets interpreted in areas other than just philosophy seminars and academic departments. And this was a really great kind of test case or a study to see how film lives on in another arena, in this case, filmmaking. At least that was the attempt. Whether or not I was successful in all of that, that's what I told myself I was doing as I was writing the book.
I think you were totally successful. I mean, I was slightly resistant when I first saw the book. Well, for two reasons. One, I was finishing my own book. So when I saw your book, I literally wrote to the publisher and went, okay, the jig's up. We've been gazumped. And the second reason is I did kind of I did read a lot of film philosophy literature on Malick prior to writing my own, but also prior to even conceiving of the idea of writing a book. And it has in some ways had perhaps a deleterious effect on Malick, on the way people look at him, and they almost look at towards his films as if they have to know philosophy in order to to appreciate his movies. And what I appreciated about your book was that that wasn't the case.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And without getting too much into sort of the academic weeds, I kind of in the book suggest that it's almost because of Malick that we have this new sort of subfield in the academy called film philosophy, right? This idea that film in and of itself, and there are many different interpretations of what film philosophy is or what it entails, but this idea that film is a subject worthy of philosophical discussion and interpretation. And one of the things I suggest is that the origins of this sort of new field really go back to Stanley Cavell, who, of course, was one of Malick's teachers at Harvard. And Cavell wrote this book, The World Viewed, in the early 1970s, where he sort of makes a case for philosophers taking film seriously, right? And philosophers before then had written about fiction or drama or poetry, of course. Heidegger wrote a lot about poetry. But the idea that philosophers should spend their time writing about popular media like movies was kind of laughed out of the academy until Cavell really made a case that no, these are worthy of philosophical study too. And when that book got reissued in the later part of the 1970s, Cavell referenced a couple movies that he thought were on par with philosophy, the philosophy of somebody like Heidegger, right? That you could take passages from Heidegger and scenes from these films, and they were kind of equally important to think about. And those films happened to be Terrence Malick's. And so this sort of set the trajectory for this discussion. And so to me, there's a kind of funny irony or paradox here. Malick, I think, leaves academic philosophy because it's a little too narrow and constraining. The kinds of questions he wanted to ask his teachers are like, oh, we don't do that stuff anymore. We don't talk about those things. And then he goes and makes these movies where he can do that kind of philosophical work. And while he's away in Hollywood or, Austin or wherever making movies, academic philosophers, having read Cavell's book, his former teacher, are sort of like, oh, movies are important. Maybe we should write about them. Well, what movies should we write about? How about these movies by this guy who's making philosophical movies? And so there's a kind of separation that is Cavell goes one way, Malick goes the other way, inside the academy, outside the academy. And then with Malick's career, we have a rapprochement where we have these two threads coming back together, right? That, oh, and I even say in the book, and I think it's true, university students today are more likely to be introduced to philosophy via a class like philosophy and film than they are via a traditional like survey of ancient, modern, medieval philosophy or anything like that. And so I kind of try to use Malick's career not just, or I try to talk about Malick's career not just on its own terms, but also as a window onto what's happening with academic philosophy too. That there's initially a kind of push back against the idea of movies being philosophically worthy of discussion, and then this just great embrace, right? Where the only way to write about movies is in this sort of philosophical way. But I share some of your um, reticence, I guess is the right word, about a lot of the philosophical writing about Malick's films, because there is a sense in which for philosophers, sometimes the philosophy comes first, right? That they have a sort of philosophical idea or position that they kind of want to work out. And then the movie becomes a kind of case study or example for them to kind of use in their philosophical writing. And I kind of went the other approach, which is to say, what is the philosophy that's animating Malick's movies on their own terms, right? And for that, you need a kind of intellectual genealogy, maybe. Rather than saying, well, I think this movie is Heideggerian. Here's what Heidegger says. Here's the movie. Voila, I'm done. I tried to take a different approach, and hopefully that's a kind of corrective to some of the film philosophy.
I love the way as well that you put everything in context. I mean, you just brought up Heidegger there, and you ask a really simple question which hadn't really occurred to me, but it's absolutely vital, which is, well, which Heidegger? Heidegger himself has an intellectual journey, is as dramatic as any of the people we're talking about thus far. And so when you say someone is is thinking about Heidegger when they're doing something, you have to say you have to be a little bit more precise because Heidegger doesn't even agree with Heidegger at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I guess my training as a historian comes out, right? What we do as historians, intellectual historians especially, is try to contextualize things, which is not to say that everything is only a result of its historical context, but that historical context does have a shaping influence, even for something as seemingly immaterial as ideas or philosophy. And that was one of the things I thought was missing in writing about Malick was a sense of the context, the intellectual context that may have shaped him. So I tried to go back and look at the state of philosophy, not just in the US, but very specifically at a place like Harvard, which is one of the top philosophy programs then and still today, and to look at what was going on in philosophy and what a student like Malick may have been exposed to or introduced to or may have been thinking about. And so there, you need to know a little bit about, the transformation of Harvard philosophy at that time. I also tried to do the same thing though with his other big I would say the other big context that shaped him, which was his training as a film student, right? A film fellow at the American Film Institute, which was a brand new program, still at the time that Malick was there, still kind of figuring out what it was meant to do and how it was going to do that. And I think one of the things that a lot of the sort of film philosophy writing about Malick has missed is that there wasn't just this leap from, oh, one day Malick was translating Heidegger and the next day he made Badlands. He had to learn filmmaking at some point. And there is a kind of training in the same way that he was trained philosophically, whether for good or for ill, he was trained cinematically. And what did that training look like? And how do we sort of bridge these two contexts, right? What was it that he took from the philosophical training into the cinematic training? What survived in that? What was transformed by that? And so I tried to show not just these two contexts, but the way in which they may be influenced or informed each other,
I
which was really fun, which was hard to do, but really fun actually, because you're sort of going back and trying to revive this past moment as a shaping force that has this kind of, I think, long-lasting legacy in his career.
Yeah, because there's a whole controversy about his sort of his methodology, if you like. He's not making films from the get-go until right now in a conventional studio context. And
Yeah.
he and not even I think if you walk onto well, people I've interviewed certainly tell me that if you walk onto his set, they're walking onto a set like they've never experienced before. And does that come from the AFI or is that coming from him? And there's another question I'd kind of like to chip in here as well is I think that talking about your intellectual historical approach, his friendship with the Harvard historian John Womack, his friendship with him and his sort of couple of years where he's toying with the idea, it's not even that, it's like a year almost on its own, where he's toying with the idea of launching himself into journalism a little bit more. I can't quite get the sense whether he's just gadding about or he's seriously considering it as a career. I that strikes me that there's a sort of that influence the idea of a sort of politically engaged Terrence Malick, which I don't feel gets enough credence, and yet you look at his movies, and they're all very politically. They're about the Second World War, the Depression, not the Depression,
Mhm.
I mean, but the exploitation between classes. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot there that's the New World, Hidden Life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this is one of the strengths of your book, which has far more detail in terms of Malick's private life, stuff that I just couldn't discover through of his life as it evolves over time. And this foray into journalism, I think you write about really well. My sense is always that, and you even talk about this too, the patrons who made Malick's early success in Hollywood possible. My sense is that he had very strong bonds of friendship and even mentorship with people. He stayed in touch with his philosophy teachers. I think, up until this day, he still talks to people he knew at Harvard, and it was friends from Harvard who kind of helped get him into journalism, right? It was connections he knew from people. And also those people also helped get him into AFI, right? That he was part of a sort of nexus of, I don't want to call them movers and shakers, but people who ended up in, for whatever reason, positions with some influence. And he made the most of that. And I think that was because he was always kind of, at least the sense I get from the research I did, he was always sort of impressing people. Stuff I found at the American Film Institute. George Stevens Jr., the founding director of it, would talk about how you could get the sense of pride that they had a Harvard philosopher as one of their film fellows, right? That this fancy expert in existential philosophy was going to be one of their first filmmakers. And so there was a sense in which the cred, if you use that word, from one area kind of bled into the others and made this very unique career possible. And I don't think I do justice to it in the book just because, I don't really have a background in film criticism or film writing itself. But what is remarkable is the freedom he has had to make the kinds of movies he has had. I don't think there's anyone who compares, right? The kind of intellectual daring of this career and the very different kinds of movies. Somebody else had to, I don't know, make a Hollywood movie at some point, or play by somebody else's rules, or do something in a compromised fashion. And I kind of get the sense that he's never compromised, that what you see on the screen is really his vision to some degree. And I think that's pretty remarkable. And he's somebody who does his own research, who writes his own scripts, who directs his own films, has a hand in the editing of those films, he's somebody who has control of the whole process, which is not to say that it's all just Terrence Malick. I think one of the things you bring out really well in your book is how collaborative he has always been, and the ways in which his filmmaking partners, whether it be an art director like Jack Fisk or a cinematographer like Lubeski, these people have really sort of made his vision possible, right? Without them, you don't get the Terrence Malick aesthetic that we all attribute to him.
I spoke to George Stevens for the book, and George Stevens is I mean, he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom earlier this week.
Yeah.
I imagine he's a busy man. He's had a long life, and he might not necessarily want to make time for a pesky writer wanting to talk about something that happened 50, 60 years ago. And he was so keen to talk to me about Terrence Malick, because he just thinks, oh no, he's one of the best things AFI produced, and he's so proud of him, and everything he's done.
Yeah.
And that speaks to what you said just now about, these people are very impressed with Terrence Malick and want him to be out there. Let's get to some of the films, because I think we're going to skip to Night of Cups in a moment, but the way you read the films, I think, is really, and you said earlier, I have no training in film writing. I can't see that in the book at all. I read as good. That's as good as it gets. That's film writing as good as it gets. There are lots of observations and readings that you do, which bowled me over. I just thought, that's particularly you talk about Bresson in terms of hidden life, for instance, and that was something that hadn't occurred to me. But once you read your art, once I read that chapter, I now can't unsee it. It's definitely, it's just so, it's like, how did I not see that? And it's so beautifully fitting that's something I sometimes there's sometimes this image that you get of of Malick als almost as being otherworldly and not somebody who you could imagine sort of buying a ticket and going and sitting down and watching someone else's film. But what I think you bring up very well is that no, he is watching other people's films, and he is. He is he's I mean he's not like a Martin Scorsese who is a film
Mm,
historian and film director almost equally. There's almost an
yeah,
equilibrium between those roles. Malick isn't
yeah.
that. You don't really you'll have to look deep into the archives to find him expressing any opinion on other filmmakers.
Hmm.
Although he does send private letters to we, occasionally it'll pop up a little letter that he's sent to Asif Kapadia about The Warrior or something like that. But those first few films, what I also liked, sorry, this was meant to be a question and I've ended up going on way too long. But what I liked is each chapter you have this idea of how okay, what is going on in Badlands in terms of him emerging from his training as a philosopher, and how is he
Yeah.
dealing with this? But then when he's going to Days of Heaven, there's also a different tradition of philosophy being expressed there, and it's not just
Yeah.
it's developing as it goes. It's not just here's philosophy with a capital P here and here and here. It's moving
Yeah.
as he's evolving himself.
Yeah, I tried. One of the things I tried to do, it was something I tried to do in my dissertation, was to think of each chapter as a kind of case study in and of itself. So in this book on Malick, I tried to kind of use and I basically sort of break down his career into each chapter corresponds with a film or a couple films in the later chapters. But I try to kind of isolate certain influences that were the genesis or the origin or the shaping influence on that film. And I kind of bring, some influences are at the start of a career, right? That obviously the influence of Harvard philosophy or AFI film training, those will always be there. But it seems to me that with some films, certain influences kind of stand forward or foregrounded, and other influences kind of fade to the background. And then, of course, as you go on in life, you develop new interests and passions and influences as well. And so, and this is why, some of the first articles I ever wrote when I was just testing out this idea of maybe possibly writing about Terrence Malick and philosophy, I said, oh, this is Heideggerian cinema, because I had written about Heidegger and I knew this guy translated Heidegger. So that must mean that everything is Heideggerian. And then when I actually started doing the work, I was like, whoa, this film is far more inspired by Kierkegaard. This film is far more inspired by. And then as I started to do more in the sort of film research, I realized that the intellectual content and the stylistic form, right, were in much more conversation than I had been willing or ready to really understand. And that's where I think that AFI training is important, because at AFI, that was a kind of cinematic education for Malick himself, right? And that's where these sort of philosophical ideas that I think he was interested in and remains interested in uh, started to find shapes or outlets in certain kinds of filmmaking, right? You sort of pick your in the same way that you pick your literary inspirations or your philosophical inspirations, you pick your cinematic ones too. And I think you're right. Unlike somebody like, say, a Scorsese or a Paul Schrader, who kind of wear those influences on their sleeve very proudly, right? Paul Schrader can rip off Bresson over and over and over and over again and be very explicit about it. And I think with Malick, it's much more analyzed, digested, synthesized, that these influences, whether it be from or Renoir or others, these influences are sort of are they're digested into his own outlook or his own filmmaking tradition. And so it's harder to find them. But I was always suspicious of the idea, and I think it's just sort of my training as an intellectual historian. I was always suspicious of the idea that Terrence Malick style kind of emerged out of nowhere, that it was totally sui generis, right? That like Athena from the head of Zeus, we just get this figure, Terrence Malick, and he transforms everything. I think he is very unique, but that uniqueness comes not from a rejection of all cinematic influences or philosophical influences, but from the unique way in which he channels them into new directions, into new ways of filmmaking. And I think people haven't necessarily understood how simultaneously experimental that is, right? They talk a lot about the improvisational filmmaking techniques of the later films, especially the jettisoning of using scripts and things like that, but also how conventional AFI, as I understood it in the early days, was trying to create a new cinematic art form, but it was using the traditions of Golden Age Hollywood to inform that. So these young filmmakers were trained simultaneously in sort of Golden Age cinema, but were also told to make it new. And I think that's a good way to understand the uniqueness of Malick's own filmmaking, which combines some of the hallmarks of the grand tradition of Hollywood filmmaking in some respects, but yet at the same time is still radically new, inventive, and experimental. So it's no accident to me that somebody like George Stevens Jr. would say, "Oh yeah, Terrence Malick, he's the embodiment of the AFI ethos." And my sense is AFI is very protective of that because, he is one of their most illustrious graduates, even though there's, David Lynch and Patty Jenkins and all kinds of, other people come from AFI. But certainly Terrence Malick is, perhaps their most famous graduate.
As you were talking about that mix between golden age Hollywood, traditional Hollywood, and experimental stuff, it's also one of those contradictions or agreements with that is I always feel that at his most experimental, he's trying to remake film as almost a silent medium again. So there's this, you know what I mean? There's this. It looks like it's going into the future, but it's also urging itself into a sort of an old form, really.
Yeah, in fact, in research I actually sort of completed after the book was done, I found memos in the papers of George Stevens Jr., which are now at the Academy archive. I found memos he wrote Malick on set, and in those memos they talk a lot about silent film technique, right? That from the beginning, Malick was really interested in shooting the Thin Red Line as if it were a silent film. And, and that was one of the shaping influences. And you look at it now, knowing that, and you're like, oh, yeah, I could totally see how this was shot that way. And there is this sense that I also just got the sense in the research that Malick is incredibly curious, right? There's a sense of wonder in everything he does. I think there's philosophical roots in that too, but he's just curious in picking up techniques or picking up skills or picking up ideas sort of wherever he can, whether it be philosophy or filmmaking or natural science or whatever, and play with them, seeing where they lead, seeing what happens with that. And I take that to be one of the real strengths of his filmography, this sense of inventiveness or playfulness or just flat out wonder, right? He's not making a product that fits into a box that can be sold. He's exploring things and sort of taking you along for the ride in that exploration, hoping to maybe spark some desire to explore in the viewer too.
That's wonderfully put. I don't want to confine our discussion necessarily to Knight of Cups. So by all means, feel free
Okay.
feel free to burst out of this box that we're going to go into now. But I thought it would be a good way of segueing into it because I rewatched the film last night, and I have to say I was one of those people who I didn't see Knight of Cups on the big screen. I saw it on DVD a while after its release. So that already says something about how my initial sort of love affair was with Terrence Malick was slightly not as enthused as it had been. My initial response on the small screen wasn't great. I've it's grown a great deal in rewatches. And last night I watched it, and it's just like, wow, that's a five-star film for me. That's just so to use my journalistic parlance for a moment. And the point of segue I wanted to use was, it's so Antonioni. It's like Antonioni
Mm.
made by someone who doesn't want to take the main thing that Antonioni does, which is the sort of long, sort of quite sterile shots of things, and he actually wants to sort of speed it up and make it a bit more frenetic and make it a bit more. But there's the threesome with the girls and that looks like the David, what's his face, doing the photographs. I keep wanting to say David Hockney because I'm thinking of the swimming pools as well, but it's not David Hockney. The main actor, David Hemmings, in Blow Up. You've got all that. Blow Up is just going throughout that film, I feel. And then you've got Fellini, and you've got the Antonio Banderas looking like Marcello Mastroianni, and giving these sort of the Rouish type of speeches. I don't know. I just find that film, and then there's moments of remarkable bliss almost in the midst of this apparently sort of angst-ridden, mournful journey. You have this Las Vegas scene, which is transcendent, and he finds transcendence in them. Basically, I'm assuming with the benefit of some MDMA ingestion, and the Cirque Soleil, and it's just like, it's what's going on here. It's a remarkable a remarkable film for me, and all the better really for not getting it for a long time.
I mentioned this to you when we were exchanging emails. I have a real soft spot for Knight of Cups, which I realize puts me perhaps in a minority, or I've come to realize that as I've done a few events for the book, talks and discussions and things across the country, because I've realized that a lot of people really to this day don't like it, or kind of rolled their eyes, and maybe that was your initial response to it. And I found myself trying to articulate why I have a soft spot for it. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that I actually had the sort of very memorable cinematic experience when I saw it on the small. I saw actually, at the time, I was on sabbatical living in Los Angeles. There was a premiere at the United Artists Theater in downtown LA, which is an old grand movie palace. I think from like 1927 is when it dated, back when, that strip of Broadway had just tons of old movie theaters. That was kind of the dawn of cinema back then. And it has since been refurbished. It's attached now to the Ace Hotel or something like that, and do concerts there. But to go see a film, a Malick film, in this big grand auditorium with lots of decoration. And then there were producers there. I think Sarah Green and Nick Gonda were there, if I remember correctly, but also Christian Bale was there and some of the other actors. And so there was a kind of Q&A after. And to go to a Malick film and to have it sold out in this grand, huge, beautiful auditorium is sort of memorable, especially when the movie is about Los Angeles and you sort of recognize all of these sites, shots from just up the street on Broadway and, just a couple streets away, even in Skid Row. And so there's this kind of, oh yeah, finally Malick, is making a movie about LA, and I'm from LA originally. So there's that sort of connection. And then I would say a few weeks after that, I can't remember exactly. I should write my friend, but a friend of mine was visiting from the UK actually, and he's very much a Malick fan. And I took him to the Huntington Gardens in San Marino, which is a beautiful place with gardens and archives and things like that. And we were kind of talking, and at the time I was trying to work on this book, and we sat on a bench in the Chinese gardens, and I tried to articulate what my thesis for the book was, and I think he was kind of skeptical, as he always is, whether or not it would work. And then I took him, actually, the movie was still playing, but only in Santa Monica in this sort of metroplex. And I took him and my girlfriend at the time, we went to go see this film. And I think it was such a stark contrast because I went from seeing this movie a few weeks before with this packed auditorium in downtown LA to this multiplex where there were 8 of us in the theater, and it seemed like already the movie had run its course. And we're sitting there, and then there's this shot in the film. I don't know if you recall it because you said you just watched it. There's a shot in the film of a parking garage that's sort of lit with neon. It's a kind of aerial shot. I don't know if it's a drone shot or not, but well, it just so happens that was the parking garage that we parked in to go see the movie at the Metroplex. And I was like, man, if Lubezki can make a parking garage in Santa Monica look that good and ethereal, there's something going on here. Even better, there's a scene later in the film, in a section of the film that I actually take to be very important intellectually, where Christian Bale's character Rick is talking to Peter Matheson's character, who's Christopher, I think, in the film, and they're walking the gardens where the gardens of the Huntington Gardens in San Marino. And they at one point sit down on a bench in the Chinese gardens. Well, it just so happens that that was the exact same bench my friend and I had just sat on the day before, talking about the book I was going to maybe try to write about Terrence Malick. So there are all these weird sort of moments of synchronicity that just sort of shone out to me in a way that, and much about a person losing their way and trying to find their way again. And it's also, it should be said, I think, perhaps Malick's most autobiographical film too. And I was trying to figure out how his life and his work went together. And here was a film where it seemed like he was doing precisely that. How does my life make sense? And how do I make sense of it now that I am a filmmaker looking back retrospectively on this period of my life? And so for all those reasons, the movie just really stuck with me. And in some ways, I think it really helped me understand what I was trying to do with the book, which is to show how somebody who is interested in exploring the meaning of life can pursue that philosophically, but also through the arts, cinematically as well. Yeah. And then, of course, there are problems with the movie. And I think the clearest one that's come out in the scholarship, and I think rightfully so, is the portrayals or the representations of women in the film. My girlfriend at the time was the first to point this out to me, and she's now my fiance, about to get married soon. So,
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, my first and best critic. And so I had to think a lot about the shortcomings of the film, even as I appreciated the overall arc or trajectory, if that makes sense. And it was also just a great way to show how some of the intellectual influences I had been trying to trace in Malick's life and career find expression in a specific cinematic form. Yeah, I can talk more about that, but I feel like I rambled on quite a lot about my film going experiences.
No, rambling is entirely the point, and in keeping with with Knight of Cups, I feel it is a film which doesn't seem to be, it is to some degree about directionlessness, and I mean it's about, he tends to go back and forth, it's almost every encounter he has, he takes them, at some points he takes whoever he's with to the sea for a paddle. And then that sort of recurs with at least 3 different characters. I mean, his mum even has a paddle at some point. It's sort of like, mum came to visit and then I took her for a paddle.
Yeah.
And it's almost like that's almost, for me, seems to be like a maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's almost like a criticism of the film itself. Is like the filmmaking itself is this attempt to be spontaneous, but there's a limited number of things you can do to be spontaneous in Los Angeles. Where can you go to be spontaneous in Los Angeles? You can go to the beach.
Yeah.
You can go to the museums, maybe. You can go to parties. But after a while, all these spontaneous things begin to look, well, kind of like routine, And my criticism when I first watched it, I had a real problem with blocking. I just sort of started, I was thinking, just block your scenes, man. Block your scenes. Everybody looks
Yeah,
like they don't know
yeah,
where
yeah.
to stand. And of course, in my research, I find out that's entirely intentional. Nobody is being told where to stand. Everybody is being forced to
Yeah,
sort of meander,
yeah.
and that's kind of it's not a bug, it's a feature, you know. And the frustration I'm feeling
Yeah,
is part of that.
yeah, and I think that's where the film might be more Fellini than Antonioni,
Mm,
right? That there's a sense, especially in those sort of party scenes up in the Hollywood Hills with Antonio Banderas and a whole range of other people who have cameos in lots of ways. There's a sense that, and I really thought was his homage, Malick's homage to Satyricon and these sort of great, sort of this movie that has a life and an exuberance that kind of breaks through the formalism of somebody like an Antonioni, right? That he's
mm.
trying to capture things as they're happening. And a lot of what you read from people, and you know this better than I do because you talk to a lot of these people, the sense I got from reading comments from people who've worked with Malick at this stage in his career or after is that Malick is always looking for the spontaneous moment because he's suspicious of the staged or the theatrical, right? The too blocked, as you put it, and looking for things that would normally have been left on the cutting room floor of the editing suite, the stuff that, oh, well, that doesn't move the plot along, or that doesn't represent an idea, and trying to find things that kind of slip through the cracks of a pure formalism. Um, and that's because he's trying, I think, to capture a sense of life, not an artist rendering of a life, if that makes sense. Um, and I think there's a kind of dialectic in his work too, where where you have this experimentation, improvisation, and then a kind of fall back into some formal structure or constraint. And you see that most especially with A Hidden Life, right? A kind of retreat back to script writing and perhaps sticking closer to the script, as if to say that you don't have to go all the way to pure experimentalism, right? That experimentalism can still be in the service of a more structured kind of filmmaking. And it would be really interesting, of course, and we're all waiting for this to see how that might materialize in something like The Way of the Wind, right? To what degree it is experimental and to what degree it is formally constrained in any way.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the funniest things about these, especially the so-called Weightless trilogy, which is, you know, To the Wonder, Knight of Cups, and Song to Song. Although that trilogy is contested, and you give a very good argument for the trilogy of Tree of Life, To the Wonder, and Knight of Cups, which I think is true from a biographical point of view. I think that's a very I think that's a very convincing grouping. But the Weightless trilogy, I think, from a formal point of view, feels. I feel like Tree of Life is beginning that, but it's almost like
Mm,
he really steps off solid ground with those last three. And I feel that there's always this thing that they say, oh, there's not a script, and he himself has said, you know, I've tried to get rid of scripts, and I've tried to, you know, famously he said that he repented at doing so. But I've always feel that there is a script. I always feel that there is
mm,
I mean, Nicholas Gonda told me that there was always a huge file of stuff
mm.
that would essentially be the script. So it wouldn't look like a conventional script, but they knew that they had scenes to cover. They knew that they had to
Yeah,
they had a Vegas section, and they had a, you know, there were these women who were very specific and very, and they had these
yeah.
roles. And I kind of, you're absolutely right. I feel in this idea that the biographical genesis of this film is the 1970s, and pretty much before he wrote before he directed Badlands, while he was a script doctor, and
Mm,
maybe in between Badlands and Days of Heaven, while he was still, you know, he made more money writing scripts that never got made than he made writing and directing and producing Badlands. That's how
yeah,
he paid off his debts.
yeah.
I'm not sure if it's not a very convincing defense. I'll say that straight away. But my response to uh, the problem of the problem of female representation in the film and how one-sided a lot of the characters. I've kind of got two. One is it's if it was a period film set and it looked like a Paul Thomas Anderson film, it would be you would see that the attitudes of the male characters were much more in keeping with the context
Mm,
of the period.
mm,
I'm not entirely the reason that's weak is not that's not any apologia for not Paul Thomas Anderson has very strong female characters in Boogie Nights, so
yeah, yeah.
that doesn't necessarily work. My other sort of defense of of him from that, and this is not a wholehearted defense, I'm not entirely, maybe devil's advocate would be a better way of putting it, is that Christian Bale himself is such an empty character, such a one-dimensional character in many ways. I mean,
Yeah.
that rewatching it, I was kind of surprised by how much you did get of the other. The women are really the characters.
Mm,
You get more interiority from Natalie Portman and Kate Blanchett than you do from Christian Bale in this
mm,
movie. And
mm,
so,
mm,
yes, Imogen Poots is her character could be described as an overuse of eyeliner, or
mm, mm,
there are roles that could be described as lingerie model number two, lingerie model number one.
mm,
And that you might say it might be very uncomfortable. But how do you? I mean, a film in which you have a character say women are like flavors. Someday I like strawberry, someday I like raspberry. It doesn't strike me as a film that's not aware of objectification or
mm.
the using of women for gratification. I mean, it feels like that's quite aware that that's a thing.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right about that, right? Like I don't think Terrence Malick is saying that we should certainly accept what Antonio Banderas has to say about women being like flavors, right? This is supposed to be kind of gross and disgusting and over the top and gauche and all that kind of stuff. I think and I think those are both very valid defenses. My sense is it would be very interesting to have set this film like the other autobiographical films, and I actually don't really use the term autobiographical in the book. I call them confessional films. Because there is an autobiographical element, but it's an autobiographical element that is transformed somehow into archetypes, right? In confessional literature. So the idea is that you're not just watching Terrence Malick's life on screen, you're watching a life on screen that sure may have roots or resonance with the life of the writer and director, but it could be a stand-in for anybody's life, right? And that's I think one of the reasons why these protagonists in Into the Wonder and Knight of Cups are kind of empty shells, right? Because they're meant to be stand-ins for the viewer to kind of start that process of memory and reflection, right? To look back on our lives. And if it had been shot as if it were, say, Inherent Vice or something like that from P.T. Anderson, as if it were a 70s film, it would be very different, I think. But that would also be very expensive. And I think there is an economy, right? There's an economy to making a film quickly like this in an incremental way that's set in the present, where you don't have to get period dressing and costuming and all that kind of stuff. But my defense, or I don't know if it's a defense, my explanation, I think, of the way in which, and your book, I think, does a really good job, much better than mine on this film's autobiographical elements. You've actually identified who some of these women were in Malick's life, right? Pointing to actual real people. And when you know that autobiographical detail, their roles in the film become much more explicit, I think, easier to decipher and to understand what role they played in Malick's life at that time. But I think there's also an element, as with all of his films, that he's drawing inspiration from literary sources. And those literary sources don't necessarily have a whole lot of room for women to be fully fledged characters. And this goes back to your comment about Malick being a writer. One of the things I tried to really emphasize in the book is that while he's an important director, he is also the writer of everything he ever directs. And I think far too little attention has been paid to his writing and how formative and how important that is for his thinking and for his filmmaking. And sure, when he gets on set, perhaps he gets rid of the script or he tosses it aside and goes for the moment or the inspiration. But I think you're exactly right to say that all of this inspiration and all of this improvisation and spur of the moment inspiration is rooted on a really dense, thick, heavy foundation of research and writing and rewriting. And I tried to give a sense of that by showing some of the sources and discussing some of the sources that he was in conversation with. And these are sources that in his scripts he'll actually quote, or in some cases, just kind of steal or borrow passages from some of these texts and put them in there. I have a friend who worked in production in Hollywood for a little while, and he was from Virginia. He had a friend in Virginia who worked on the set of the New World. And he said that I guess one of the days on set, I think it was towards the end of the shooting, they had to sort of move from one location to another. And this friend just spent the day moving boxes of scripts and research notes and papers. There were literally boxes and boxes. And all of that, of course, was the research that went into the New World or the scripts or the notes or the whatever. All of those are important. And this is all in a long-winded way, to get back to Knight of Cups. I really think that Knight of Cups is a kind of confessional Christian allegory. It's Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And we get that sort of audio narration at the very beginning of the film. And when you look at these two things on top of each other, it's like, oh, this is the formal structure that he's using, is following this narrative. So yeah, not a lot of room for women as strong characters in Pilgrim's Progress. But then the other one, and I make a big deal of this, and I think you do too in your book, is the influence of Walker Percy. And I think that's something that hasn't been appreciated fully in the scholarship or the writing about Malick. I think The Moviegoer is a really formative book for him. As you know, and as you write about really well, he tried to adapt it. He wrote a script for it. I'm not sure if he ever intended to direct that, but he certainly worked on it for a long time. And I think there's a sense in which Knight of Cups is kind of like his adaptation of The Moviegoer as well. And The Moviegoer doesn't necessarily have the best gender politics either, and a lot of Walker Percy's works don't either. And so there's some sense, and maybe he was sticking too close to that. Yeah, that's not a defense, but I think it is a kind of another explanation. If we can understand some of the source material that went into this film, we can kind of understand the film it became, if not necessarily the film it was received as. But I still think I think for his career, it's a really important sort of turning point in a lot of ways.
I love what you said about Walker Percy because and Walker Percy goes throughout several of your chapters because he's that important. He's someone who, and for anybody who hasn't read The Moviegoer, it is a really fascinating book. It's kind of like, I think I compare it to Catcher in the Rye, even though the protagonist is a sort of middle-aged version of Holden. I feel that there's the same sort of, you're stuck inside a subjectivity which is trying to look at the world in a different way and is engaged in a search, which is certainly what is the main sort of thrust of the novel. I mean, there's a thing that I discovered when I was talking to one of the editors was and this goes back to a sort of self-awareness that I think he has in terms of his reception, which is often something that I feel with the fact that he doesn't give interviews, he doesn't turn up on red carpets. People tend to think, okay, he's built himself this ivory tower, he's immune to criticism, he doesn't read reviews or anything. But the editors were telling me that he really wanted to do this without voiceover. He thought this was going to be his first film that he's going to do without voiceover. And then it was discovering the John Gielgud that made him decide to get rid of that idea because he just wanted that piece of audio at the very beginning. And he thought,
Mm,
well, it won't make any sense if I do that and then I don't have any other voiceover for the rest of the film.
yeah, yeah.
And so he sort of painted himself into the corner of using it. I also like the story that he put in the very opening shots of the Aurora Borealis from the space station, almost on purpose to piss people off who didn't like the sort of creation sequence of Tree of Life, almost as if it was going to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
people go, "Oh no, not this again." Which I mean is I think that shows a kind of awareness and a kind of sense of humor of, I know what you expect me to do, so here we go.
I think, look, the Gielgud, I didn't know about that until I read your book about the Gielgud narration, which is really important, as is another one by Charles Laughton too. That comes a little bit afterwards. But
And
one of the things I
Ben
hope I
Kingsley as well. Ben Kingsley has a little bit in there
y-
as well.
yeah. But one of the things I tried to do in the book, I don't know if I was very successful at it, was to highlight his sense of humor, right? I think so many people think, oh, this ponderous philosophical filmmaking, and it's all about whispered voiceover narration. But I think he's actually, I think he's actually very funny. And when you read some of the scripts, there's a lot of humor in the scripts. And if you go back, especially to the AFI days, and Lanton Mills, his student film, is a great example of this. I think he's somebody who has a tremendous sense of humor, and that sense of humor, I think, and as does, I should point out, Walker Percy. Walker Percy was a
Hmm.
very funny writer, and he's kind of seen as a kind of homegrown American existentialist. And it's important, I think, that he's from the South, right? I think that might be part of the reason why Malick identifies, that book came out when Malick was a college student. So there's a kind of generational affinity, but also a sense of, Texas, Louisiana is not Boston, Harvard, East Northeast corridor kind of stuff. There's a sense of, oh, we have our existentialism too, right? And it's unique to our sort of regional traditions. But Walker Percy was somebody who showed that you could write about really serious, heavy things like the meaning of life and still be really funny, right?
Hmm.
And he
Hmm.
wasn't always funny. Some of the, he was also a pretty conservative Catholic too, and some of the humor I think doesn't stand up these days, but he wrote some really funny books. And I think that sense of humor is in a lot of, especially Malick's early work. I think Lanton Mills especially, but Badlands has a lot of humor that I think some people sort of miss because it's also a film about two, teenage murderers too.
Days of Heaven, Linda Manns all the way through
Linda
that
Manns,
is
yeah,
is
yeah,
is
yeah,
hilarious. And but even
yeah,
Night of Cups, I would argue there are a couple of bits. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a laugh a minute, but there's so much that's incongruous in that film that
yeah,
you have that scene with Christopher in the Japanese garden giving this speech about how you have to be tranquil and everything, and then you cut to like a toy of Scalextric cars going around a car
yeah,
track, as if like this is the
yeah,
absolute
yeah,
opposite of what. Or a woman
yeah,
in the party turns around to Christopher Bale and says, "Now it's your turn to say something interesting," and it's like, where you're going to be waiting for the whole movie because he's not going to say a damn thing.
yeah,
Or
yeah, yeah,
the photo shoot with Frida Pinto, and the woman who is sort of directing it is saying, you're a housewife on steroids. It's like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there's I don't know. It's almost as if sometimes the reputation, and this is where. I mean, this is something I did want to try to do quite self-consciously, that I wanted to tear down a little bit that reputation in order that people sort of watch the films afresh. And I think there is something
yeah,
that if you watch this film after watching To the Wonder and after reading all the reviews, this is where I think the critical reception of Malick has become damaging to some degree, is that everybody is ready to write the Malick review, You know,
Yeah.
we know what
Yeah.
the gags are. You know, the gags are
Yeah.
voiceovers, looks like a perfume advert, too beautiful, philosophy. You know, you could don't need to see the film. You can just write the review before you've even seen the film. And the thing about it is,
Yeah.
people were doing this by Days of Heaven. It's not like people have started doing it with To the Wonder. They were doing it in Days of
Yeah.
Heaven already, his second film. They were already saying this is too
Yeah.
beautiful. It's the music's good, it looks good, but the story, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things I really tried to do, look, I didn't think I would write the definitive book about Malick. I just don't think that's possible, at least not yet. Or uh, I think maybe if you put our two books together, you get sort of halfway there. But there's just so much to encompass. And of course, he's still an active filmmaker, still working. And I think there's just still so much we don't know about where he's been, but also where he's going. But one of the things I tried to do is to say, well, this is not the definitive book, but if this is a book that inspires people to think about his life and career in a new, fresh way, as you were saying, then I would be quite happy because I do think there has been a kind of consolidation into one or two or three stock opinions about his filmmaking. And somewhere at the beginning of the book, I kind of say, I encourage people because I kind of thought anybody who's going to pick up an academic book with a title like Terrence Malick in the Examined Life is probably somebody who's seen some Terrence Malick films at some point. And so I said, what you should do as you work through this book is maybe try to revisit the films before or after the chapters I devote to them, which I understand is an incredibly big burden to ask of any reader to basically say, go do your homework before you read my book, especially when the book is 400 pages or whatever it ended up being. And somewhat humorously, when the book was going through the academic peer review process, one report came in very quickly on time and, said the usual stuff. And then the other report just wouldn't come. And I kept writing the editor saying, hey, am I going to get that other report? Because we got to like move the process along. I've worked on this book for so long. Can we get, but still haven't gotten that report. Still haven't gotten that report. And when the report finally came in months later, the reader, who was very kind and very generous and offered a lot of really astute observations about the manuscript, said, oh yeah, this took so long because I decided to rewatch every film Malick has ever made as I was reading this book. And, I couldn't stop the process once I started. And the short story is, loved the experience and got a lot out of it. And so I was like, oh, that's great. I think that might be the only reader who ever does that with my book, but at least I got one. So
Well, there you go. No, look, you've got 50%. You had two readers. One of
two
them,
readers. Yeah,
and one of
that's
them
true.
did that.
Yeah, 1 out of 2, which is I
So
should be happy with
if
that.
that
Yeah,
sample is representative, you've done an excellent job. I'm
yeah,
gonna. That's a really great place to the idea of smushing books together, when the Way of the Wind comes out. I'm hoping there'll be a massive clamor for extra chapters as well. So that'll give me the
yeah,
opportunity.
absolutely.
Give me the opportunity of going back and inserting some of the points that I read in your book and was thinking, oh, damn it, is that what he was doing then?
There were quite a few in your book too. I was like, really? I missed that completely. I need to go rewatch that. So it
Uh,
goes both ways.
oh, brilliant. Well, listen, Martin, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for taking part in the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real joy.
Thank you.